Are you tired of paying higher prices at the store while watching billions in tariff revenue flow into government coffers? What if I told you there's a serious proposal on the table right now that could put $600 directly into your pocket for every member of your family, potentially delivering $2,400 to a family of 4? This isn't just wishful thinking or another internet rumor. This is real legislation that's making waves in Washington right now, and it could fundamentally change how Americans benefit from the Trump administration's aggressive tariff policies. If you want to stay ahead of the curve on financial news that could directly impact your wallet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're diving deep into the details that other channels might gloss over. The story behind these potential tariff rebate checks begins with a simple economic reality that millions of American families are experiencing right now. Since President Trump's return to office, his administration has dramatically expanded tariff policies, imposing significant duties on foreign imports across multiple sectors. While these tariffs are designed to protect American industries and generate revenue for the federal government, they've also led to increased costs for everyday goods that American consumers purchase. From electronics to clothing, from automotive parts to household items, the impact of these tariffs is being felt in checkout lines across the country. This economic squeeze hasn't gone unnoticed by lawmakers, particularly Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, who has emerged as the primary champion of what he calls the American Worker Rebate Act. But here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just about giving Americans a small token payment to ease the burden of higher prices. Hawley's proposal represents a fundamental shift in how tariff revenue could be utilized, moving away from the traditional model of simply adding these funds to general government revenue toward a direct redistribution system that puts money back into the hands of working families. So what exactly does this legislation propose, and more importantly, would you actually qualify to receive one of these payments? The core structure of the American Worker Rebate Act is refreshingly straightforward, especially when compared to the complex eligibility requirements we've seen in previous stimulus programs. Under the current proposal, every adult and dependent child would be eligible for at least $600, with the legislation specifically including language that allows for larger payments if tariff revenue exceeds current projections for 2025. This means that while $600 per person represents the floor, actual payments could potentially be higher depending on how much revenue the government collects from tariffs throughout the year. The income thresholds for these payments follow a familiar pattern that many Americans will recognize from previous stimulus programs. Individual taxpayers with adjusted gross incomes up to $75,000 would receive the full payment amount, while married couples filing jointly would maintain eligibility up to $150,000 in combined income. The legislation includes phase-out provisions for higher earners, meaning that payments would gradually decrease for individuals earning between $75,000 and $99,000, and for married couples earning between $150,000 and $198,000. Anyone earning above these upper thresholds would not receive a payment under the current proposal. What makes this proposal particularly compelling from a policy perspective is how it directly addresses one of the most persistent criticisms of tariff policies. Economic analysts have long argued that tariffs effectively function as a tax on American consumers, since the increased costs of imported goods are typically passed along to shoppers rather than absorbed by foreign manufacturers. The Yale Budget Lab recently released an analysis suggesting that Trump's current tariff policies could cost American households an average of $2,400 in 2025 alone. If that figure sounds familiar, it's because it's remarkably close to what a family of 4 would receive under Hawley's rebate proposal. This alignment isn't coincidental. The legislation appears designed to create a direct offset mechanism, where the burden of higher consumer prices is balanced by direct payments funded through the very tariff revenue that's causing those price increases in the first place. It's an elegant solution to a complex economic challenge, but it also raises important questions about long-term sustainability and economic effects. The timeline for these potential payments is another crucial factor that Americans need to understand. Unlike the rapid deployment of COVID-19 stimulus payments, which were distributed within weeks of congressional approval, the tariff rebate system would necessarily be more complex to implement. Current estimates suggest that if the legislation were to pass, Americans might see their first payments in late 2025 or early 2026. This timeline reflects the practical challenges of setting up new distribution systems and ensuring that tariff revenue has actually been collected before rebates can be issued. But here's where things get really interesting from a political and economic standpoint. President Trump himself has expressed support for the concept of tariff rebates, describing them as a little rebate for people of a certain income level during recent press conferences. However, the administration hasn't committed to the specific structure outlined in Hawley's legislation, leaving room for potential modifications or alternative approaches to achieving similar goals. The revenue numbers underlying this proposal are substantial and growing rapidly. U.S. customs duties totaled approximately $27 billion just in June 2025, representing a staggering 301% increase from the previous year. This dramatic increase in tariff revenue provides the financial foundation that makes large-scale rebate payments theoretically feasible, but it also highlights the significant impact that current trade policies are having on the cost structure of imported goods. Critics of the proposal raise several important concerns that deserve serious consideration. Some economists argue that direct rebate payments could actually encourage the continuation or expansion of tariff policies, potentially creating a cycle where higher trade barriers are maintained specifically to fund popular rebate programs. There's also the question of whether rebate payments would truly offset the full impact of tariff-induced price increases, particularly for lower-income families who spend a higher percentage of their income on goods subject to tariffs. Additionally, budget experts point out that implementing a rebate system would require careful coordination between multiple federal agencies, including the Treasury Department, the Internal Revenue Service, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. This coordination challenge becomes even more complex when considering that tariff revenue can fluctuate significantly based on trade patterns, seasonal variations, and changes in global supply chains. The comparison to previous stimulus programs reveals both similarities and key differences that could affect public support and legislative success. Like the COVID-19 stimulus payments, the proposed tariff rebates would provide direct cash payments to eligible Americans without requiring them to take any specific action or meet ongoing requirements. However, unlike emergency pandemic relief, these payments would represent a permanent policy change tied to ongoing trade policy rather than a temporary response to an economic crisis. The political dynamics surrounding this proposal are particularly fascinating. While Senator Hawley has been the primary sponsor, the legislation has attracted interest from lawmakers across the political spectrum who are looking for ways to address constituent concerns about rising prices. At the same time, some fiscal conservatives express worry about creating new spending programs, even when they're funded through specific revenue sources like tariffs. Looking ahead, several factors will determine whether Americans actually receive these tariff rebate checks. Congressional approval represents the most immediate hurdle, requiring both House and Senate majorities to support the legislation. Given the current political composition of Congress and the Trump administration's stated interest in the concept, passage appears possible, though not guaranteed. Even if the legislation passes, implementation challenges could affect both the timing and the actual amounts of rebate payments. The government would need to establish systems for tracking tariff revenue, calculating individual payment amounts, and distributing funds to eligible recipients. These systems would need to account for fluctuating tariff collections and ensure accurate distribution to millions of American households. The broader economic implications of tariff rebate payments extend well beyond individual household finances. If implemented successfully, this policy could represent a significant shift in how Americans think about trade policy, potentially increasing public support for tariff strategies by creating a direct, visible benefit for working families. Conversely, if rebate amounts prove insufficient to offset price increases, or if implementation problems arise, public opinion could turn against both the rebate system and underlying tariff policies. For American families considering their financial planning in light of this proposal, several practical considerations emerge. While the prospect of receiving $600 or more per family member is certainly appealing, it's important to remember that these payments remain theoretical until legislation is actually passed and implemented. Families should continue to budget based on current prices and income levels rather than counting on rebate payments that may or may not materialize. At the same time, staying informed about the progress of this legislation could help families prepare for potential changes in their financial situation. Following the legislative process, understanding eligibility requirements, and keeping track of implementation timelines will be crucial for anyone hoping to benefit from potential tariff rebate payments. The question of whether you'll actually receive a $600 tariff rebate check ultimately depends on a complex interaction of political, economic, and practical factors. While the proposal has gained significant momentum and appears to have support from key decision-makers, the path from legislation to actual payments involves numerous steps where complications could arise. What we know for certain is that this proposal represents one of the most significant attempts to directly address the consumer impact of tariff policies through cash payments to American families. Whether it succeeds or fails could set important precedents for how future trade policies balance revenue generation, economic protection, and consumer welfare. For millions of American families struggling with higher prices, the stakes couldn't be higher.